Oh, what a wonderful reunion. Thank you for the opportunity really to revisit the joys of my past that helped shape my conscience, and it was legal aid that truly helped shape my conscience in life. And I wanted to go through a trip down memory lane today. Some of you will like it, some of you won't like it, but my memory actually begins when cassette tapes were taking over 8-track tapes. Trickle-down economics was introduced by Reaganomics. The card catalog at the law library was replaced with electronic research. And the storing of information was not done electronically. And that's why, Karen, I think that we don't remember when things happened or who was there. I'll tell you what my mind's eye sees in a room of board members. I saw Maria Gear. I saw Michael Browdy, Ray Hamilton, Bernie Metzger, Phil Crable, Elizabeth Whitefield, and I probably have forgotten others. But that's just it. If you're relying on my memory, you're in serious trouble. So before I go down memory lane for access to justice, I want to recognize the rock in my life, my anchor, my wife, Sandra. You know, she's my CEO. No, not economics. Chief Encouragement Officer. She has always been the one to encourage me, but she's also been my CHO, Chief Humbling Officer. I never forget the day that I was supposed to be sworn in as a justice on the Supreme Court, and it's a Friday morning. Ceremony is going to take place in the afternoon, so we've been married for about 25 years, so you would have thought that I'd know better. But instead, that morning I tell Sandra, you know, today's Friday, trash day. Gotta take out the trash. I don't think it's a good idea for me, a Supreme Court justice, to be taking out the trash. Well, without missing a beat, she said, it'll make you feel better, wear your robe. So to my law clerks, I could never have done the job that I did without your intellect and your hard work and dedication. I really appreciate you, and I appreciate you, Nick, having them stand. It represents about 1/3 of the law clerks, but I have more grand law clerks than I have law clerks, that's for sure. And Justice Boston, thank you for the kind words. We were great friends on the courts, remain great friends, and I've got to tell you, I'm a little jealous of some of the opinions you got to offer. Wish I would have offered them. And the one that comes to mind, every time I think of Justice Boston, he wrote lots of great opinions, but I thought Colonias versus Rhino was probably the best case. And that was back in 2005. I don't know if you remember this, but down south in Chaparral, poor community, and as happens, regrettably, all too often, government wants to place dump facilities there. The public got tired, they decided to sue, and they were concerned because the Secretary of Environment didn't give them the time of day. They wanted to testify about what impact all of these dump sites were having on their quality of life. Secretary ignored that information, and Justice Bonson wrote for a unanimous court that this case is going back to you, Secretary of the Department of Environment, and you will consider the public testimony and how it has impacted their life. And if you decide to reject it again, and you might, explain yourself. I thought that was empowering a citizenry that was so important in New Mexico. So, Justice Dawson, thank you for that. And of course, you know, Karen and I go back many, many years and had a wonderful time. And Nick, you've always been an inspiration with your work on behalf of low-income families. I loved watching you on TV the other day and announcing that Reliable Chevrolet is going to have to ante up. That's access to justice. And of course, the first female Chief Justice, Hispanic female Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Petra, you have always been unwavering in your support of legal aid programs. Every time we had a swearing-in ceremony, Justice Maez urged people to provide pro bono services to low-income families and told them exactly how they could do it. That's a tireless commitment. So when Karen says that, yeah, we should celebrate lots of people, I say that we have to do that, because I remember classmates. I don't know how many classmates I have in this room, but Chris Garcia and Joel Jaspers devoted their entire legal career to representing legal aid clients. To me, that's an inspiration. They are my heroes. Those of you who devote your time day in and day out to this cause are my heroes. And so we celebrate you. Justice comes from the persistent work of dedicated individuals. And the people who work in legal aid programs are persistent and they are dedicated. And they made, in my mind, the decision to forego the safety and security of higher paying jobs so that they could make sure that the fundamental precept that justice must be the same in substance, procedure, and availability, regardless of a person's economic status. And so today we celebrate all of you, because America is about we the people. No exceptions. As children, we were taught to pledge to an indivisible nation with justice for all. No exceptions. Unless these words are to ring hollow, we as attorneys should practice that pledge by advocating for those who are indigent, so that they can have a voice in our government and not be dominated politically, so that they can have the tools to compete in society, so that they are not exploited economically, so that they can aspire to better things, experience the American dream for themselves, escape systematic humiliation, and enjoy the human dignity that they deserve. That's the power that we have as attorneys. And this importance of lawyers actively practicing the Pledge of Justice, Pledge of Allegiance to Justice for All, cannot be overstated, because lawyers have the research ability, the legal ability, the thinking ability, the speaking ability to make a material difference in people's lives. And I remember going around the state and I would talk to lawyers about the importance of pro bono work. Some of them would tell me, well, if I want to donate my services to the local NRA, that should be acceptable. If I want to donate my services to my church, that should be acceptable. I don't quarrel with any of that, but a common theme had developed throughout New Mexico, and that common theme was, but justice. I don't know anything about poverty law. So how do you think the people who need access to justice feel? If you as a lawyer trained how to research and speak are intimidated, they are suffering the consequences. So hopefully they got around to try to make a difference in people's life. So what I'm trying to say is that your work is critically important. It's equally important because you have to help low-income families cope with the visceral consequences of poverty. And that's worry and fear. Worry about where the next meal will come from, worry about where they might be living, whether or not a loved one is going to get the health care that they need, fear that they may never have the tools to provide for their families or the wherewithal to navigate these bureaucracies to state their own case. Worry and fear are the most brazen of thieves because they steal from us trust, they rob us of our self-confidence, and they deprive us of hope. Your work is really important. Yet the challenge to ensure access to justice becomes more daunting as we compete for state resources, face increased workloads and greater case complexity. And there's also a growing population of self-represented litigants that puts pressure on the court. Indeed, when our economies struggle, history teaches us that courts and your organization should expect increased workloads. And I see with the volunteer work that I'm doing that the mortgage foreclosures are up, rental evictions are increasing. People's rent is being increased. And the families' pressures are building. I feel it. But this is not new. The lack of civil legal services for the poor has been a problem for decades. And recognition of the problem probably began with Roosevelt's New Deal. And it was during that New Deal era that you might remember a young Democrat congressman from Texas. He actually resigned from Texas so that he could work on Roosevelt's New Deal youth program, Lyndon B. Johnson. Some of you might remember his distinguished career as a congressman and senator, but when he became president, he did not forget his roots. He did not forget what inspired him to public service. When President Johnson took over for the assassinated President Kennedy, he made the commitment to fulfill Kennedy's dream of equal justice for all. In his first State of the Union address, President Johnson declared a war on poverty. I think now it ought to be a war on greed, but he declared a war on poverty, emphasizing that the war against poverty will not be won in Washington. It has to be won in the field, in every private home, in every public office, from the courthouse to the White House. And to help fight this war, President Johnson created the Office of Economic Opportunity. And I believe Senator Dennis Chavez from New Mexico was very instrumental in that happening. Ultimately, in 1974, this was President Nixon, created a National Independent Legal Services Corporation. And that was intended to disperse federal funding to civil legal programs. That was funded with $90 million. President Carter, when he was president, more than tripled that amount of money. And if you actually took into account inflation, in order to do what President Carter was wanting to do, Legal Services Corporation would have to be funded by more than 3 times. Over $800 million would be the funding. But it wasn't meant to be, because after President Carter came President Reagan. Not only did he want to kill civil legal services, when he didn't have that avenue available to him, they reduced funding to Legal Services Corporation by 25%. And that was in the 1980s. That's when we started to think about, we need an alternative. If we're not going to have the funding from the federal government, we need to think about fundraising. And Karen's brainstorming and the board was tremendous. I thought we all worked toward that. We worked with the other organizations to make sure that we were not depleting one another's resources. And that was very important. The state bar even got involved in 1995 and did their own work, created some pro bono committees where they would actually create pro bono forums. They had pro bono clinics, things of that nature. That's 1995. Guess what happens in 1996? Again, another serious cut to funding for legal services corporations. And that's why we are so dependent on the attorneys in New Mexico to fund legal service programs. Because it's not like medicine, where you want to make contributions to see if we can find a cure for a dreaded disease. People don't think about equal access to justice. And so it's incumbent on us as lawyers to do that. And then my colleague, Justice Maes, along with beloved Sarah Singleton, chaired the Commission on Access to Justice. It was created by the court in 2004. They spent 2 years gathering data that revealed that only 20% of those eligible for legal services in New Mexico were being represented. One lawyer was responsible for up to 5,000 cases a year. No lawyer can handle 5,000 cases a year. And it doesn't matter that they may not be always complex, because there are complex cases. But a lawyer just simply can't do that. And the types of problems that lawyers and legal aid deal with are basic human needs. Housing, access to healthcare, consumer problems, benefit programs, education, employment issues, and of course, there's always domestic violence. And you need representation for that. The court did form pro bono committees, and we approved a pro bono plan. We did lots of things as a court, even with rulemaking. But my blessing at the time was the opportunity to work with Kim Posich. And I remember Chief Justice Maez used to love to refer to me as Junior Justice. And it became a real term of endearment for me. I thought, if I ever had a prestige plate, it'd probably be JR JUSTS. But it never happened. The prestige plate I now have on my truck is ALS XSUX. I think you get it. Kim left us as a result of complications with ALS. But he was a tremendous advocate for low-income families. And he and I got to work together lobbying the legislature for the equal access funds that we now have. And I gotta tell you that it was partially successful, but it was not that easy. I remember testifying, and legislators would take issue with me. They would ask me, well, why are we in this situation? Well, I knew nothing other than the truth. So I explained to them Reaganomics. And that President Reagan was the first president that not only wanted to destroy the program, but reduce the funding for it. And they did not like me attributing it to, some legislators didn't like me attributing to it. But even worse than that, legislators would ask, why should we fund programs that are going to sue us? And I thought, well, the answer is simple. Accountability. To make sure that the executive is efficiently and effectively carrying out the policies of the legislature. It's about the people. Well, that didn't satisfy some of them, but that has been a battle, and it remains a battle for some of our organizations. And so we have talked about the justice gap in New Mexico, and we've advocated for it. The studies that we've done have been important. The advocacy has been important. But your education and training as lawyers makes you uniquely qualified to not only represent the poor, but to also help our state and our nation by identifying the special needs that we have. Our democracy works best when everybody participates. And indifference deserves very little. But I'll tell you, with the work that you have done, you have been everything but indifferent. You have been at the table to make sure that poor people are represented before the legislature and the executive branches, as well as the courts. You did not ask yourselves, what's going to happen to me if I decide to advocate for the poor? You asked yourself, what will happen to the poor if I don't advocate for them? Your work is a great example of how to love your neighbor as you love yourself. As Senator Robert Kennedy once said, the true power of America does not come from our gross domestic product or our military might, but from our values and endless effort to live up to the ideals that forged this great nation. Well, the ideals of equal access to justice is to respect every American and afford them a fair opportunity to build the best life possible for themselves and their families so that they too can enjoy the riches of freedom and the security of justice. Thank you to all of you for all you have done for the low-income families in New Mexico. May God bless you.